All right, let's go. Number 10. The milk of the first herds. They are shallow clay bowls, pierced all over with small round holes, from early farming villages on the Polish lowlands, roughly 7,500 years old. Nobody could say what they were. Honey strainers, some suggested. Lamps, said others. Then the fats absorbed into the clay went through a mass spectrometer, and the answer came back as dairy fat, concentrated where liquid would have drained through the holes. They are cheese strainers, which means that almost as soon as people in Northern Europe had milk, they were doing something to it first. That something is the whole entry. In the 7th millennium before the Common Era, when the earliest pots in northwestern Anatolia picked up their first traces of milk fat, nobody on Earth could digest the stuff. The chemistry is simple and unforgiving. Milk sugar is lactose, a double molecule that cannot cross the wall of the intestine intact. An enzyme called lactase splits it. Every mammal makes lactase as an infant and shuts it off after weaning because no adult in the history of life had ever needed it. The mutation that keeps our enzyme running is a single letter on chromosome 2, and it did not exist yet. So the sugar stays in the gut, pulling water out of the body behind it. What reaches the colon is fermented into gas and acid, multiplying the osmotic load roughly eightfold. The result is cramping, distension, and watery diarrhea. For a modern adult with a full stomach and a tap, that is a bad evening. It was not a bad evening for them. Richard Evershed at Bristol spent decades building the map that shows what happened. His group set some 7,000 fat residues from 500 sites against the genetics of nearly 1,800 ancient individuals. The two curves refuse to line up. Milk residue appears in European pottery from about 9,000 years ago. The first person carrying the lactase mutation turns up around 4,700 years before the Common Era. It does not become common until somewhere between 2000 and 1000 BC. That is a gap of 4,000 years and more. 150 generations of people milking animals, storing the milk, feeding it to their families, and unable to digest it. The pattern repeats on the steppe. Milk proteins in dental calculus show almost nothing there before the Bronze Age, and then a sudden switch. 10 of 11 earlier individuals are negative. 15 of 16 Yamnaya individuals are positive, and persistence was still rare among them. Which raises the obvious question. If milk did not make people ill enough to matter, why did the genes sweep it all? Evershed's answer is the disturbing part. Across 500,000 living Britons, the genotype barely predicts anything. 92% of people who cannot produce lactase drink cow's milk anyway, and the variant makes no measurable difference to how long they live. What fits the ancient data is not milk. It is settlement density and population crashes, standing in for disease and famine. The mechanism is precise, and it is brutal. Gut infection destroys the cells at the tip of the intestinal lining, and those are the cells that make lactase. An infected person becomes less able to handle milk at the moment they are already losing fluid. And milk is a famine food. The thing a household falls back on when the stores are gone, on the emptiest bodies. The inconvenience becomes fluid loss on top of fluid loss. That is how a diarrheal illness kills. The strainer is the other half. Draining the curd carries fat and protein into the cheese and takes the lactose out in the way, and bacteria eat most of the rest. The oldest cheese anyone has recovered came off the chests of mummies in the Taklamakan Desert, 3,600 years old. The microbes in it were sequenced. It is kefir. 2/3 of the adults alive today still cannot digest fresh milk, and we drink it anyway. A clay sieve from a Polish field solved that 7,500 years ago, and the solution has never been improved on. It has only been industrialized. Number 9, the bowl passed at the door. In February of 1755, the Russian Academy of Sciences published a description of Kamchatka by Stepan Krasheninnikov, who had spent a decade on the peninsula with the Second Kamchatka expedition. Buried in it is a paragraph readers have argued about ever since. He describes a feast. Fly agaric mushrooms are steeped in water and drunk, and the wealthy men in the house take them. Outside, Krasheninnikov writes, "The poorer sort wait by the walls for a guest to come out and relieve himself, holding a wooden bowl to catch the urine, which they then drink." That is the entry, and it is one of the most unsettling sentences in the ethnography of any northern people. A drink taken secondhand, out of another man's body, on purpose, because the drug had not finished with it. The mushroom is Amanita muscaria, the red cap with white flecks everybody can draw from memory. The reports come from a scatter of northern peoples, Koryak and Chukchi in the far northeast, Itelmen on Kamchatka, Ostyak and Ket across Siberia. A Swedish officer held prisoner there had noted the same practice in 1730. The pharmacology is the reason it works, and it is not what most people assume. The cap contains two related compounds. Ibotenic acid drives glutamate receptors, the excitatory side of the nervous system. Muscimol drives GABA receptors, the inhibitory side. But the first is really a delivery system for the second, because it loses a carbon dioxide molecule and becomes muscimol, both when the mushroom is dried and inside the body. Roughly a fifth makes the conversion, and muscimol is 5 to 10 times the stronger. Here is where the practice stops being an anecdote about poverty. A substantial fraction of the ibotenic acid is filtered out by the kidneys within 20 to 90 minutes, chemically unaltered. It reaches the bladder, still able to convert. The urine is not a residue. It is an unfinished dose. One thing in the popular version is wrong, and it has been repeated for decades. It is not the muscimol that survives the trip. Feeding trials in mice found very little injected muscimol coming out the other side. It is the precursor that passes through. The second drinker completes the reaction the first one started, taking a fraction already metered by a body without the rest of the mushroom. That matters because the mushroom is genuinely dangerous, and its danger is that it will not hold still. A single cap can carry 6 milligrams of muscimol and up to 70 of ibotenic acid, and mushrooms fruiting in spring have been measured at 10 times the alkaloid content of the same species in autumn. The ethnographers recorded a normal dose of 3 mushrooms, and men frequently taking 10 or 12. Estimates of a lethal quantity sit at around 15. Those two numbers are far too close together. Fly agaric has an undeserved reputation as harmless. It is not the death cap. It does not destroy the liver. And the usual line is that nobody has reliably died of it in a century. Then, in 2022, an unsettling case appeared in the wilderness medicine literature. A 44-year-old man ate 6 to 10 dried caps bought online for their supposed health benefits. He was asleep within half an hour, and 9 hours later, he was found in cardiac arrest. His heart was restarted, but he never woke up, and he died on the 9th day, with the autopsy attributing it to the mushroom. The archaeology behind all this is thinner than the pharmacology, and that needs saying plainly. On cliffs above the Pegtamel River in Chukotka, there are engravings reported in 1965 and studied by the archaeologist Nikolai Dikov. Among more than 100 groups of reindeer hunts and boats and whales are 34 human figures with mushroom shapes rising from their heads. Dikov read them as fly agaric, using Chukchi ethnography to interpret pictures made perhaps 3,000 years earlier. He was honest about the circularity and hoped the reading would one day be confirmed. It has not been. Other specialists see headdresses or a dance. So, what we are left with is a set of pictures nobody can decode, a pharmacology that works exactly as described, and one grim paragraph by a Russian naturalist about men standing in the cold outside a rich man's house with a bowl. Number 8. The Nubian beer. In 1980, a physical anthropologist named George Armalagos was looking at thin sections of bone under ultraviolet light. The bone came from a cemetery in Sudanese Nubia, from the population archaeologists call the X group, buried between roughly AD 350 and 550, and salvaged before the Nile rose behind the Aswan Dam. Under the lamp, the sections fluoresced in bands of yellow-green. That color has one well-known cause in bone: tetracycline. Tetracycline binds to calcium and is laid down permanently in bone and growing teeth, in a band marking the moment of exposure. Doctors use exactly this effect to time bone growth. The compound was isolated from a soil bacterium in the late 1940s and became one of the most widely used antibiotics on Earth. It has no business being in a 4th century Nubian skeleton. These people lived on the Nile, near the Second Cataract, in the centuries after the Kingdom of Meroe came apart. They farmed a thin floodplain, stored their grain in pits, and buried their dead in the desert above the water. The bones carried the bands in adults and children alike, and in more than one layer. This was not one exposure. It happened again and again, across a population, over generations. The claim sat contested for 30 years, and the objection was serious. Bone buried in soil is not a sealed container. Fungi and bacteria colonize it, and published work argues that fluorescent banding can be produced after death by microbes working through the tissue rather than by anything the person swallowed. Soil is full of the organisms that make tetracycline. The bands might have been evidence of the grave, not the diet. In 2010, Armelagos and the chemist Mark Nelson answered that objection directly. They dissolved the bone in anhydrous hydrogen fluoride, which strips away the mineral and releases the small molecules locked inside it, and put the extract through liquid chromatography and mass spectrometry. Tetracycline came out, identified through its stable breakdown product. The molecule was real, and it was inside the mineral. The route into the body is what puts this on a list of drinks. Tetracyclines are made by Streptomyces, soil bacteria that live in every field on Earth and manufacture the compound as a weapon against their competitors. Grain harvested off the ground and stored in a mud bin picks them up. In the Nile Valley, the standard use for stored grain was a thick, sour, low-alcohol fermented mash, still made in Sudan under the name bouza, closer to gruel than to anything in a modern glass. It is warm, wet, mildly acidic, and left standing. That is a culture medium. The beer was the delivery system. The drug came free with the staple. What makes it disturbing is not that the medicine existed. It is who was taking it. Nelson reported that the bones of a 4-year-old child were saturated with the compound, which he read as deliberate dosing of a sick infant. That may be right, but nobody controlled the dose because nobody could see it. Tetracycline is contraindicated in young children today, in every prescribing guideline in the world. The reason is the property that made it visible in Nubia. It chelates to calcium and deposits in developing teeth and bone, staining the enamel permanently and affecting the way bone grows. A modern doctor will not give it to a child under 8 unless the alternative is worse than a lifetime of gray teeth. These people were drinking it daily, from infancy, at a strength set by whatever happened to be growing in the grain bin that season. The honest limit goes here, because the chain is not complete. No Nubian beer residue has ever been analyzed. The mash is an inference from ethnography and from what the grain was for, not a measurement. What is established is the molecule in the bone across a population over 2 centuries. And the deeper point does not depend on the beer at all. The bacteria that make tetracycline have been in the soil for a very long time. So the antibiotic has been in the food chain just as long, at low and irregular doses. That is the precise condition under which resistance is selected. Resistance genes have been recovered from permafrost tens of thousands of years old, and from caves sealed off from the surface for millions. The chemistry never belonged to us. We isolated it in 1948, prescribed it by the ton, and then discovered that the bacteria had already had several 100 million years to prepare. Number 7, the cup of hemlock. It grows in ditches, along riverbanks, on waste ground, at the edges of fields, across Europe and Asia, and now most of North America. There is a tall plant with lacy white flower heads and a hollow stem blotched with purple. It looks like a dozen other things in the carrot family. It smells unpleasant when crushed. That is the only warning it gives. Conium maculatum, poison hemlock. People knew what this plant does long before anyone wrote it down. By the time an Athenian court could order a man to drink it, the knowledge was old enough to be routine, and the state had built a procedure around it. 5 alkaloids do the work. The principal one, conine. It is concentrated in the root and the seed. Its molecular shape is close enough to nicotine that it binds the same receptor, the one where a nerve meets a muscle. What it does there is two-stage. First, it fires the receptor, producing tremor, salivation, a racing heart. Then it jams it open until the junction stops responding at all. The muscle receives no signal. The paralysis is flaccid, not rigid, and it climbs. It starts in the legs, and when it reaches the muscles that drive the ribs and the diaphragm, breathing stops. The brain is not touched. The person is awake for all of it, which is the frightening part. And somewhere between 100 and 300 milligrams of conine will do it to an adult. That is perhaps 6 to 8 fresh leaves. Less, if it is the root. Athens made this the instrument of the state. Execution was administered by an official in a prison, with the condemned man drinking it himself. The most detailed account in any literature is Plato's description of the death of Socrates in 399 BC. That account is famous for its calm. Socrates drinks, walks about until his legs feel heavy, lies down. The man who brought the cup presses his foot and asks whether he can feel it. He cannot. The numbness moves up through the shins, the thighs, the waist. He is talking almost to the end, then covers his face, says one last sentence about a debt owed to Asclepius, and dies. For most of the 20th century, classicists treated that as a lie. The argument was made in print in 1973 and again in 1977, and it was a medical one. Real hemlock poisoning, the critics said, is violent. It produces convulsions, vomiting, thrashing, loss of control. Plato had sanitized his teacher's death into a set piece, and the serenity was literature. The rebuttal came in 2001 from a scholar named Enid Block, and it turned on a confusion of 2 plants. Water hemlock is a different genus with a different poison, and cycatoxin does cause exactly the convulsions the critics described. Conium does not. Conium produces an ascending flaccid paralysis that neurologists compare to Guillain-Barré syndrome, with the mind clear and the failure ending at the lungs. Bloch did not argue this from theory. She went back to the 19th century case literature, where physicians took hemlock, extract themselves, and recorded the results, one writing that his legs felt as though they would soon be too weak to hold him while his thinking stayed clear. And she found a man in Scotland in 1845, handed hemlock leaves someone had mistaken for parsley, who died 3 hours later of a painless paralysis that started at his feet. Plato had described the pharmacology correctly, and it took 150 years of medical case notes to prove it. The mistake that killed that man is the one still being made. Every year, people foraging for wild carrot, parsley, celery, anise, or parsnip pull up the wrong root, and the published cases follow the same grim shape. Weakness. Then, the arms. Then, the sensation of not being able to draw a breath. And here the ancient world and ours separate completely, because of one machine. The modern reports overwhelmingly end in recovery. Conine is cleared, and nothing has been destroyed. The paralysis is reversible, and if a person can be kept breathing for a day, they walk out of the hospital. So they are intubated, put on a ventilator, and the machine does the only thing the poison prevents. That is the whole difference. The plant in the ditch is the plant that stood in a jar in an Athenian prison. The alkaloid is identical. The receptor it blocks is identical. Athens chose it because the outcome was certain, and the outcome was certain because nothing existed that could breathe on a man's behalf. Number 6. The bronze cup of the Shang. At Jiahu, in Henan province, there is a Neolithic village occupied from about 7,000 years before the Common Era. Among the pottery are long-necked jars, and absorbed into their walls is the oldest fermented drink anyone has identified anywhere. Tartaric acid from hawthorn fruit or wild grape. Beeswax compounds from honey. Markers of rice. 9,000 years ago, in the Yellow River Valley, people were making something out of rice and fruit and honey and leaving the residue in the pot. Follow that tradition forward 5,500 years, and it arrives at one of the most recognizable objects in world archaeology. The Jewy is a bronze cup on 3 splayed legs, with a long pouring spout and a pair of small-capped posts standing up from the rim. Beside it stands the gu, a tall, trumpet-shaped beaker made for one hand. Shang tombs are full of them. They held warm grain wine for ancestral ritual and for the feasts of the aristocracy. Sealed examples from Anyang still had liquid inside when the corroded lids came off. Rice and millet wines flavored with wormwood, chrysanthemum, and tree resins. The problem is what the cup itself was made of, and it is a brutal one. Chinese ritual bronze is copper and tin, and the founders added lead. How much varies enormously by workshop and period. Elite vessels from the tomb of Fuhao average under 2%. Vessels from the last phase at Anyang cluster around a quarter lead by weight, and some early Western Zhou pieces are effectively lead objects with a trace of antimony. Lead lowers the melting point and makes the metal run into the fine detail of those molds. It was an engineering decision. It was the right one. In 2010, a group of clinical toxicologists in Boston did the obvious experiment, which nobody had done. They took 3 reproduction Shang goblets, cast at 8% lead, filled them with water, rice wine, and grape wine, and measured what came out of the metal. After 1 day, the water held around 14 milligrams of lead per liter. The rice wine held 46. The grape wine held 116, and the concentrations were still climbing at the end of the week. Their arithmetic is worth stating slowly. A man drinking a liter a day from such a cup takes in something on the order of 85 milligrams of lead. The modern limit in drinking water is 10 micrograms per liter. The wine in that experiment was over 10,000 times it, an extraordinary number to find in an object made to be beautiful. Lead does not announce itself. It substitutes for calcium and zinc and iron in the enzymes that need them, and the early signs of chronic exposure are fatigue, headache, loss of appetite, irritability, and a slow flattening of attention, which produces an uncomfortable question about the historical record. When the Zhou overthrew the Shang around 1046 BC, they explained the conquest. One of the oldest documents in Chinese literature, the announcement about drunkenness, says the last Shang king gave himself wildly up to drink, that heaven therefore sent down ruin on the dynasty, and that spirits were to be taken only at sacrifice. It goes further than moralizing. It orders officials who hear of companies drinking together to arrest everyone and send them to be put to death. In 1977, an art historian named Catherine Lindoff, cataloging the lead in these vessels, pointed out that chronic plumbism and the accusation of drunkenness are not easy to tell apart at 3,000 years distance. She was careful about it. The texts are of uncertain date. Some of these vessels were for pouring libations to the dead rather than drinking, and the announcement is conquest propaganda written by the winners. But the metal is not propaganda, and neither are the bones. At Hengshui in Shaanxi, Western Zhou tombs produced 65 bone and tooth samples, measured by mass spectrometry. The lead in those skeletons tracks social rank. The people buried with the bronzes carry a different burden from the people sacrificed beside them. There is no equivalent study of Shang-era bone, and that gap should not be papered over. The case for a poisoned aristocracy is an inference built from 3 pieces, not a demonstrated finding. What is not in doubt is that the Western Zhou quietly changed the ritual set. The wine vessels thin out. Food vessels take their place. Historians read that as a religious and political reform, and it almost certainly was. The cups themselves are in museums now, behind glass, in every major collection in the world. They are 3,000 years old and completely inert, because nobody has put anything in them for 3,000 years. Fill one with warm rice wine in the morning, and by evening it would be doing exactly what it did then. Number 5. Toloache. In 2020, a team led by the archaeologist David Robinson published an examination of a cave ceiling in the hills of Kern County in Southern California. The cave is small. On the ceiling is a large red painting of a pinwheel, a whorl of curved arms, and beside it, a figure with a rounded body and what look like antennae. The rock is conglomerate, pocked with hollows, and in at least 56 of them, somebody had jammed a wad of chewed plant fiber. 15 were recovered. Under an electron microscope, the fibers were identified as Datura wrightii, the sacred Datura of the American West. 4 went through liquid chromatography and mass spectrometry, and both alkaloids came back, atropine and scopolamine. Radiocarbon put one wad in the 16th century and another in the 18th. Three-dimensional imaging found paired compression marks, top and bottom, teeth, and the painting, the authors argue, is not a vision. It is the plant. The Datura flower opens at dusk, unfurling into 5 curved arms, and the creature beside it is the hawk moth that pollinates it. Nobody had ever had physical proof that people took a hallucinogen at a rock art site. This is it. But it is worth being exact. Because these wads were chewed, not drunk. The drink is documented elsewhere, and it is the more dangerous form. Across native California, the root was ground, sometimes lightly roasted, and steeped in cold water. Among the Luiseno, the bark was scraped and dried as much as a year ahead, then pounded to powder by the chief, and sifted into a sacred stone bowl of water. The drink was Toloache. It was given to adolescents at initiation, and it sat at the center of a religious system running from the Chumash through the Tongva and the Luiseno. The Chumash word for the man who administered it means the one who causes intoxication. He was a specialist, and he was paid. He judged the dose from the soil the plant grew in, its age, the size of the root, the season, and the strength of the brew. The initiate had spent 3 weeks beforehand on thin, unsalted acorn gruel. No meat, no fat. Among the Luiseno, the chief held each boy's head in his palm while he drank and lifted it away when the boy had taken enough. The initiates grew dizzy, fell, and were watched by old people until it passed. That is not ceremony for its own sake. Every one of those steps is dose control, and the reason they existed is in the ethnographic record in 3 separate places. Alfred Kroeber, writing on the Cahuilla in 1908, recorded that a number of deaths had resulted from excessive quantities. Lucille Hooper, working with an old man named Juan Lugo, who had been through the ceremony 60 years earlier, was told several men had died from drinking too much or eating the wrong thing afterwards. And Richard Applegate, writing on the Chumash, put it flatly: deaths from Datura were not unknown. There is a detail in Applegate's account that is hard to read past. When it happened, the blame did not fall on the man who mixed the drink. It fell on the person who had drunk it for breaking a taboo. The chemistry explains why no expertise could have made this safe. Datura carries hyoscyamine, atropine, and scopolamine, and the quantity swings by something like 9-fold between one plant and the next, with soil, altitude, and rainfall. Worse, the ratio between the compounds changes as the plant ages. Scopolamine in the root can fall to nothing once flowering begins, which alters not just the strength of a dose, but its character. The alkaloids also shut down the gut, so a stomach full of the infusion empties slowly and unpredictably. A dose that seems survivable after 2 hours can keep loading for several more. None of it can be seen, smelled, or tasted. The Toloacheros' rules about soil and season were a real response to real variation, but they were an estimate made in the dark, and the arithmetic underneath them was brutal. The drink reached far south of California. At an Inca site in northwestern Argentina, processed seeds of Datura ferox came off a ceremonial platform, directly radiocarbon dated to the 15th century. The reading is that they were an additive to maize beer, drunk in public ritual on the platform itself. The last part of this belongs to the emergency rooms. In 1994, in Texas, 2 adolescents died after drinking a tea brewed from Jimson weed root and cut with alcohol. In California the same year, 6 teenagers drank the same thing, and 4 went into intensive care. Health authorities had counted over 300 Jimson weed exposures across the United States the year before, and by the middle of the next decade, such poisonings had risen 6-fold. The plant is still in the ditches, the roots are still in the ground, and the recipe is on the internet. What we no longer have is the man who spent his life learning how much of it a 15-year-old could take. Number 4. The wine boiled down in lead. Human beings have smelted lead for something like 8,000 years, which makes it one of the first metals anyone learned to pull out of rock. It melts at a temperature a cooking fire can reach. It is soft enough to hammer cold, and it does not rust. The Romans used it for pipes, roofing, coffins, cosmetics, and cooking vessels. They also used it to make sugar, and they had no idea that was what they were doing. Grape must, the pressed juice before it ferments, was boiled down across the ancient Mediterranean to concentrate it. Reduce it by half, and it is defrutum. Reduce it to a third, and it is sapa. It appears in more than a quarter of the recipes in the surviving Roman cookery book, and a splash sweetened a sour vintage and stopped it turning to vinegar. Then come the instructions, and they are the entry. Pliny the Elder says leaden and not copper jars should be used for the boiling. Columella, writing a farm manual for people who did the work, is more explicit. The vessels should be of lead rather than brass, he says, because brazen vessels throw off copper rust in the boiling and spoil the flavor. He is right about the bronze. Copper alloys leach verdigris into hot acid, and verdigris is bitter and green. Lead does something else. Grape must is acidic. Simmer it for hours in a lead pot, and the acid strips lead off the metal into the syrup as lead acetate. Lead salts are sweet, so sweet that the compound was sold for centuries as sugar of lead. Lead is also an enzyme poison, so it killed the organisms that would have soured the wine. By every measure a Roman cook could apply, it was the best pot for the job. In 1982, a scientist named Joseph Isinger reduced grape juice to a third in a lead-lined pot, exactly as described, and measured it by atomic absorption. He got a dark brown, pleasant syrup carrying roughly 1 gram of lead per liter, and an analysis a century earlier had come out in the same range. Columella also gives the dosing ratio for wine. Apply it, and something like 20 milligrams of lead goes into every liter of the finished drink. The legal limit in our drinking water today is 10 micrograms. The bodies confirm it, and this part is measured rather than argued. Tooth enamel from Roman Britain runs at a median of 1.2 milligrams of lead per kilogram, and from the city of Rome at 3.6. Enamel from the same island in the Neolithic and the Iron Age sits near 0.06, and after the empire withdraws, the values fall back. Across 5 imperial cemeteries, children's enamel carries nearly 3 times the lead of the adults buried beside them. So the exposure is real. It is enormous, and it falls hardest on the young. What was done with that fact for 40 years is the cautionary half of the entry. In 1983, a geochemist named Jerome Nuriagu argued in the New England Journal of Medicine that 19 of the 30 emperors between the late Republic and the 3rd century had a taste for lead-tainted wine, suffered gout because of it, and that lead helped bring down the empire. It was picked up everywhere, and it is still repeated. But it did not survive contact with the specialists. Within a year, the historian of medicine John Scarborough found the underlying book so full of false evidence and miscitation that its arguments could not be trusted, and others added the demography, and the point that no such thesis explains 1,000 more years of the Eastern Empire. The collapse story is dead. The lead was not. In January 2025, a team reading 3 Arctic ice cores published a record of atmospheric lead across Europe from 500 years before the Common Era to 600 after. The signal rises with Roman silver mining, holds through the Pax Romana, and falls away with the Antonine Plague. Across the 2 centuries of the imperial peak, More than 500,000 tons of lead went into the air. They then modeled what that would have done to a child's blood and a child's brain, and reported 2 to 3 points of intelligence lost across the population of the empire. That figure is a model. No Roman's blood was tested. But notice what the ice does to the story. The exposure it describes is airborne. It comes from mining and smelting, and it falls on farm workers hundreds of miles from a senator's table. The wine was never the main channel, and the emperors were not the victims. We took an extraordinarily long time to put the metal down. The last leaded petrol on Earth was burned in Algeria, and the United Nations declared the era over in August 2021. Blood lead in our children has since fallen by more than 90%, and every search for a safe threshold has failed. There is no known safe exposure to lead. The Romans knew the metal made workers pale and sick, wrote it down, and went on boiling their fruit juice in it because it made the wine taste better. Number 3. The Skull Cup. In a cave at the mouth of Cheddar Gorge in Somerset, excavators recovered pieces of human skull that had been worked. The face has been struck away. The base has been removed. The bone around the rim has been chipped back and scraped smooth, all the way round, until what is left of the head is a bowl. 3 of them came out of that cave. They are about 14,700 years old, the oldest directly dated skull cups anywhere in the world, made at the end of the last ice age by people following the retreating cold north into Britain. That country had been empty for thousands of years under the ice, and these were among the first people back into it. The work is not crude. When the marks were studied, the sequence recovered was a procedure. The scalp cut away, the flesh removed with stone tools, the facial bones detached, the vault trimmed and finished. Other human bones in the same deposit carry cut marks where muscles attach. Long bones were broken open for marrow, and some of the bone carries human tooth marks. One forearm bone was engraved with a zigzag before it was broken. These people were eating their dead and turning the skulls into containers. There is no way to know what went into them. No residue survives. And it must be said plainly that nobody has ever recovered a pathogen from Gough's cave or shown that anyone there fell ill. The cups establish the practice. The danger belongs to the practice, and to what we now know it does. Because there is a category of disease transmitted almost exclusively by consuming the tissue of your own species, and it is the strangest infectious agent ever described. A prion is not a virus and not a bacterium. It carries no genetic material at all. It is an ordinary protein the body already makes, folded wrong, and its only property is that when it touches a correctly folded copy of itself, it converts it. The misfolding spreads through nervous tissue molecule to molecule until the brain fills with holes. Nothing stops it. And this is the horrifying part. Cooking does not. Prions survive temperatures and chemicals that destroy every conventional organism. Hospital sterilization that kills everything else has passed them between patients on surgical steel. There is no treatment and no vaccine. The outcome is 100% fatal. The documented human case is Kuru, described in the 4 Highlands of Papua New Guinea in the 1950s by Vincent Zigas and Carlton Gajdusek. The 4 ate their dead at mortuary feasts. It was an act of respect and of grief, and the women and children took the parts the men did not, including the brain. Kuru killed thousands, and it killed women and children at many times the rate of adult men, for exactly that reason. The practice was given up around the end of the 1950s. Cases kept appearing for another half-century because the incubation period of a prion disease can run past 50 years. A person can be infected as a child at a funeral and die of it as a grandparent, with nothing to feel in between. That is the haunting arithmetic of this disease, and it is the most unsettling thing about it. Nobody can say what a single meal costs until the bill arrives. And then there is the genetics, which is where this stops being about other people. The gene that codes for the prion protein has a common variation at one position. People who inherit 2 different versions of it are substantially protected. That heterozygosity is unusually common in every human population on Earth. In 2003, a team argued that the global pattern is the signature of ancient prion epidemics, and that our species has been through this before, repeatedly, everywhere. That argument is contested. The statistics were challenged almost immediately, and it should not be presented as settled. But a second finding from the same work is much harder to argue with. Among the four themselves, a protective variant appears that exists nowhere else in the world, and it arose within the last 100 years, under the direct pressure of the epidemic. A population changed its own genome inside a century because of what it ate at funerals. Britain then ran the experiment again by accident. Cattle were fed the rendered remains of other cattle. The disease crossed into people through beef, and fewer than 200 died. That was enough to shut down an industry, ban the practice worldwide, and permanently change the rules for blood donation in several countries. The cups from Cheddar Gorge are in the Natural History Museum in London. They are pale, thin, carefully finished, and the rim of one of them still shows the individual scrape marks where somebody smoothed the edge so it would not cut a lip. Whoever did that work was holding a relative. Number 2. The pond with the worm in it. It begins with a blister, usually on the foot or the lower leg, and everybody who has had one agrees about the burning. The skin swells, the burning becomes intolerable, and there is one thing that stops it: cold water. So the leg goes into the pond. That is the moment the parasite has been waiting for. The blister ruptures, and out of it comes the head of a worm, discharging a cloud of milky fluid carrying hundreds of thousands of larvae into the water. The worm behind the head can be the better part of a meter long, no thicker than a strand of spaghetti. It has been inside the person for 10 to 14 months, and the design is horrifying, precisely because it is so simple. The pain does the work. Dracunculus medinensis, the Guinea worm. The rest of the cycle is a drink. The larvae are swallowed by copepods, water fleas a few millimeters across, and mature inside them over about 2 weeks. Anyone who drinks that water unfiltered swallows the copepods with it. Stomach acid kills the flea and frees the larvae. They bore through the gut wall into the abdominal cavity. There they mate. The males die. The females spend the better part of a year traveling through the connective tissue toward the skin, growing to full length, carrying up to 3 million embryos, and arriving at a limb a year after the drink that started it. There is no drug that kills it. There is no vaccine. There never has been. What there is, and has been for at least 3,500 years, is a stick. The emerging worm is wound onto a twig or a strip of gauze a few centimeters at a time. The stick is turned once a day. It takes days, often a month. Pull too hard, and the worm snaps inside the body, and what follows is violent inflammation, abscess, and sometimes sepsis. That is the entire treatment we have ever had. The oldest physical evidence is Egyptian. In a tomb in the Valley of the Nobles at Thebes, dating to about 1450 BC, a body was found with the serpentine tracks in the skin over both legs, and one of them held a gravid female packed with larvae. A second mummy, examined in Manchester in 1975, showed a calcified serpentine structure in the abdominal wall on X-ray in a girl of 13 or 14 whose lower legs had been amputated shortly before she died. 2 specimens is a thin record for a disease that afflicted millions. And there is a technical reason. Guinea worm produces no eggs in the feces, so the standard method of ancient parasitology, sieving burial sediment, cannot find it. It can only be caught in preserved tissue, and preserved tissue is rare. The genomes tell a longer story. In 2020, a team sequenced worms from human and animal cases across Africa and modeled the population history. The West African lineage separates from the others around 20,000 years ago, at the height of the last glacial maximum. The Chadian and East African populations diverge around 4,000 years ago, as the Sahara dried and human settlement of it collapsed. Those are model estimates from a small sample and should be held loosely, but the shape is clear. The worm's family tree has been cut by the same climate events that cut ours. which means it has been traveling in our legs for a very long time. In 1986, there were an estimated 3.5 million cases a year across 20 countries. Then a campaign started with no medicine in it at all. Cloth filters with a mesh fine enough to strain out a coat pod, larvicide in the ponds, boreholes, and the operational core called case containment, finding every infected person within a day of the worm emerging and making certain that leg never touches open water again. Cash rewards were paid for reporting a case. In 2023, there were 14 human cases in the world. In 2024, 15. In 2025, 10 provisionally. 4 in Chad, 4 in Ethiopia, 2 in South Sudan. That is a reduction of more than 99.99% against a parasite for which no drug exists, achieved by changing how people drink water. And it is not finished, for a reason nobody predicted. Chad had reported no cases for a decade and was close to certification when the disease came back in 2010. And in 2012, it turned up in animals, overwhelmingly domestic dogs along the Chari River. The dogs are not catching it by drinking. They eat fish guts and aquatic animals, and larvae have been recovered from frogs, which seem to carry the parasite without developing it. The genomes closed that loop too. The worms in the dogs and the worms in the people are one population, with parent and offspring pairs across the species line. In 2024, there were 15 human cases and 664 animal infections. The parasite that has been inside human legs since the Ice Age has spent the last decade quietly moving into another animal, which is a haunting way to survive its own eradication. It is still there, in the water, waiting for somebody to be thirsty. Number 1. The water. The Camarones River runs west out of the Andes and across the Atacama, the driest desert on the planet, reaching the Pacific about 100 kilometers south of Arica in northern Chile. Along that line, there is almost no rain and no other permanent water. The valley is a thin, green thread with sand on both sides. There is a village on it, and there are people in it today. The water in that river carries more than 1 milligram of arsenic per liter. Our guideline value, set by the World Health Organization, is 10 micrograms. The river runs at about 100 times the limit, and at the thermal springs in the same basin it has been measured 20 times higher again. Nobody put it there. It comes out of the volcanic rock of the Andes, and has been coming out for as long as the river has. People settled that coast anyway, and stayed for 4,500 years. They were the Chinchorro, fishers, and gatherers on the most productive stretch of coastline in the hemisphere, where the Humboldt Current fills the sea with anchovy and shellfish and sea lion. That upwelling peaks almost exactly at the latitude they occupied, so the food was extraordinary. The fresh water was a string of river mouths across hundreds of kilometers of absolute desert, and there was no alternative to it. They are also the people who made the oldest artificial mummies in the world, 2,000 years before Egypt. They took their dead apart, cleaned the bones, rebuilt the bodies over sticks and reeds, remodeled the faces and painted them. The earliest anybody has dated is a child from the Camarones Valley, 5,000 years before the Common Era. The arsenic is measurable in them. Single strands of hair from 46 mummies were read by laser and mass spectrometry, and the Camarones group averaged nearly 38 micrograms of arsenic per gram, with individuals up to 147. In forensic terms, 1 microgram per gram is normal, and anything past 10 is where poisoning turns potentially lethal. There is an obvious objection to hair from a grave. The sediment in that valley is itself loaded with arsenic, so the metal could have moved in after death. That was tested on another Atacama mummy with a synchrotron, mapping where in the strand the arsenic sat and what it was bound to. It was spread evenly through the hair rather than coating the outside, and bound to sulfur the way arsenic binds inside a living body. It was drunk. The archaeologist Bernardo Ariaza has argued for 2 decades that the poison and the mummies are connected because chronic exposure sharply raises miscarriage, stillbirth, and infant death. And the earliest artificial mummies are children from the worst valley. He has always called that a hypothesis, and nothing excavated has separated it from the simpler reading, that bodies in that desert do not decay, and somebody noticed. What arsenic does to a body is not in dispute. In one form, it locks onto the sulfur groups of proteins and shuts down the enzymes that need them, including the one that lets a cell burn sugar. In the other, it impersonates phosphate and jams the machinery that makes ATP. Worse, the liver's attempt to detoxify it produces intermediates more genotoxic than the compound itself. It is a confirmed human carcinogen. Chronic exposure writes itself on the outside of a person. Dark patches of pigment spread across the trunk and neck in a pattern described as raindrops on a dusty road. Hard keratin builds on the palms and soles. Then, decades later, the cancers arrive. And the modern control is what turns this into the last entry. The city of Antofagasta, 400 kilometers down the same coast, drew its water from a new aqueduct between 1958 and 1970, and it ran at about 860 micrograms of arsenic per liter. That went to an entire urban population in the 20th century for 12 years before it was cleaned up. 40 years later, the region's mortality was set against the rest of Chile. Lung cancer deaths ran at 3.4 times the national rate in men, bladder cancer at nearly 5 times in men and over 6 in women. Mortality did not peak until at least 20 years after the exposure ended, and was still elevated 4 decades on. Stillbirths ran at nearly double the rate of a comparable Chilean city. 12 years of drinking water, half a century of dying from it. That is one of the most disturbing latencies ever measured for anything a human being swallows. Something in that population appears to have responded over a much longer span. A gene called AS3MT governs how efficiently the liver methylates arsenic. A protective version of it is carried by about 68% of people in the Camarones Valley, against 8% in southern Chile, where the water is clean. Genotype predicts how a body handles the metal, and that much is solid. Whether the pattern is natural selection is genuinely contested, and one of the authors of that study has since published the strongest objection to it. Andean populations passed through severe genetic bottlenecks, and bottlenecks shuffled gene frequencies in ways that are hard to separate from selection. Either way, it did not solve anything. 32% of the people in that valley do not carry the variant, and there is no version of this gene that lets a person drink arsenic safely. At best, it moves the odds. That is the honest end of 7,000 years in the Camarones Valley. The mummies are in the museum at Arica, and the earliest of them, with the clay faces and the reed frames, are children. The village is still there. The river still runs at 100 times the limit, and a solar plant strips most of it out before the water reaches the tap. That is the entire difference between us and them. Everything else on this list can be refused. You can decline the mushroom and the datura and the wine in the bronze cup, and you can filter a cope pod out of a pond with a scrap of cloth. Water is the one drink nobody has ever walked away from, and arsenic in groundwater cannot be seen, smelled, or tasted at any concentration that will kill you. The World Health Organization estimates that around 140 million people in at least 70 countries are drinking it right now. In Bangladesh alone, chronic exposure is estimated to account for something like 1 death in 20. Those people are not making a choice. They are doing what the Chinchorro did, which is drinking the only water there is, in the only place they can live, and paying for it 30 years later. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.